Eastern State Penitentiary is a real place in Philadelphia. It opened in 1829 as an experiment in solitary confinement, built so that every prisoner would sit alone with his own thoughts. The prison eventually abandoned that system. It closed in 1970. But even after it closed, people told stories about the building. Visitors spoke of figures moving between empty cells. A locksmith once described an awful feeling when he removed an ancient lock from a sealed door. Former guards mentioned footsteps in galleries that should have been empty. No official report proves any of it. This story is fictional, but if you ever stand beneath the central tower of a prison, designed to make silence feel alive, you may understand why some stories refuse to die. 3 nights after Eastern State received its final transfer order, Officer Thomas Mercer was told to return for one last shift. It was February of 1970. Philadelphia was covered in sleet. The streets around the penitentiary shone black beneath the lamps, and the prison rose above them like a wet stone fortress. Thomas had worked at Eastern State for 6 years. He knew its noises. The pipes groaned in the cold. The old gates settled after midnight. Wind could find a crack in any wall and make it whistle like a man trying not to cry. But on that night, the prison had no inmates. Every living prisoner had been moved to another facility. The kitchen was empty. The exercise yards were empty. The hospital wing smelled only of bleach and rainwater. Thomas was there with one other employee, Ada Holloway, the records clerk. Ada was 62, sharp-eyed, and so careful with paper that she wore cotton gloves while turning pages. She had worked in the administration office longer than Thomas had been alive. "Inventory," she told him, sliding a ring of keys across the desk. "Then we lock the place and let the city forget it." Thomas tried to smile. "You think the city can forget a building this big?" Ada looked toward the dark hallway beyond the office. "Buildings remember themselves," she said. "That is the problem." At 11, they began their rounds. The prison had been designed like a wheel. A central hub stood in the middle, and cell blocks ran from it in long stone spokes. From the tower, a guard could look down each corridor at once. That was the theory, anyway. Thomas checked locks while Ada recorded them in a leather ledger. Cell block 2, empty. Cell block 4, empty. Cell block 7, empty. By 1:30 in the morning, sleet was striking the skylights hard enough to sound like handfuls of thrown gravel. Then, at exactly 2:17, every clock in the prison stopped. Thomas first noticed the office clock. The second hand trembled. It reached the 17-minute mark, clicked once, and froze. The hallway clock froze with it. So did the pocket watch in Ada's hand. Neither of them spoke. From somewhere beyond the records office came the sound of iron striking iron. One sharp knock, then another, then a third. Thomas picked up his flashlight. "Loose gate," he said, though he did not believe it. Ada closed the ledger. "Don't answer it," she whispered. Thomas stared at her. "Answer what?" The sound came again. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. Then a voice rolled through the empty corridor. "Count." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The words seemed to come from inside the walls. Thomas stepped toward the door. Ada caught his sleeve. "When the blocks were full," she said, "the officers counted men all night, every few hours. Names, numbers, heads in beds. You never spoke to anyone after the count was finished. That was the rule." "Why?" Ada's fingers tightened around his coat. "Because sometimes an empty cell answered back." Thomas almost laughed. He had heard every version of that story from older guards. In one version, a dead man asked for water. In another, a prisoner begged to be released. In the oldest version, the voice only asked a single question. "Are you here?" Thomas had never believed it. But he did not laugh. The prison bell rang once. The sound traveled through every cell block, thin and metallic. In the silence after it, Thomas heard a low murmur begin far away. 1, 2, 3. The voices were counting. Not together, not in rhythm. Hundreds of separate voices, men and women of different ages, whispering numbers from behind locked doors. Ada released him and ran to the ledger cabinet. "It shouldn't start without a roster," she said. "It needs a roster." She pulled out a book Thomas had never seen before. It was narrow, bound in black leather, and sealed with a rusted hasp. On its cover, someone had written in faded ink, "Night count." "This was never supposed to be here," Ada said. "What is it?" Something the old captain kept. He said it was superstition. Her voice was shaking now. He died before he told me where he found it. Thomas lifted the hasp. It opened without resistance. The pages inside held lines of names and inmate numbers. Some were so old that the ink had browned. Others were written in blue ballpoint pen. At the bottom of the last page was a fresh entry. Thomas Mercer. No number followed it. Just a blank space, waiting. The whispering reached 12. Thomas backed away from the desk. "You wrote that," he said. Ada looked offended for only a second. Then her face collapsed. "I didn't," she said. "But it knows you were here." The office lights died. Thomas turned on his flashlight. Its beam cut across the desk. The ledger, Ada's pale hands. The numbers continued from the hallway. 13. 14. They were moving closer. Ada opened a drawer and removed a folded map of the prison. She pointed to the central hub. "The count begins at the outer blocks and comes toward the tower," she said. "When it reaches the center, it asks for the missing name." Whose name? Anyone who listened. Thomas wanted to tell her that was impossible. Instead, he looked down at the ledger. "How do we stop it?" Ada swallowed. "We leave before it reaches the center, and whatever speaks to us, we do not speak back." They left the office together. The corridor beyond was darker than it should have been. Thomas's flashlight reached only a few yards before the beam seemed to thin and disappear. The walls were damp. The air smelled of stone dust and old wool. They passed cell block 7 first. Every cell stood open. Thomas knew that was wrong. He had checked those locks an hour earlier. Now the doors hung inward, each one breathing a little in the wind. At the far end of the gallery, one cell held a dim yellow light. Inside stood a man facing the wall. Thomas stopped. The man wore a gray prison uniform. His hands were behind his back. His head was lowered as if he had been standing there for years. "Thomas," Ada said, barely breathing, "don't look at him." The man spoke without turning around. "Officer Mercer," he said, "am I here?" Thomas felt the answer rise in his throat. "Yes." Ada slapped a hand over his mouth. The flashlight flickered. In that brief darkness, the man in the cell turned. Thomas saw only a face made of shadow and a pair of eyes reflecting his own light. Then the cell was empty. The numbers had reached 89. They hurried toward the central hub. As they crossed the old stone passage, Thomas saw names scratched into the paint. Not prisoner names, guards' names, clerks, nurses, men who had worked there long after the original solitary system was gone. Beside each name was the same tiny mark, a circle with a line through it, like the numeral 0. Ada saw him looking. "Those are people who heard the question," she said. "Some quit, some stayed, some were transferred. But none of them ever stopped dreaming about this place." "And you?" Ada did not answer. At the hub, the prison opened around them. 7 long corridors radiated into darkness. Above them, galleries curved beneath the tower. Rain tapped the broken skylight. Thomas aimed his flashlight upward and saw movement on every level. Figures stood behind the railings. They were too still to be living. The count had reached 300. Ada stood at the center of the hub and unfolded the old map. On the back was a note in the same brown ink as the ledger. "When the count asks, give it the name of the one who began it." Thomas stared at the words. "Who began it?" Ada's eyes filled with tears. "The first man admitted here," she said. "The first prisoner. The prison was built to keep him alone. Maybe it never learned how to let anyone go." Thomas looked toward the highest gallery. A single door stood there, painted black. It was the oldest door in the prison. "Then we give it his name," he said. "We don't know his name," Ada whispered. "The earliest intake papers were moved years ago." The whispering stopped. For 1 second, the entire prison held its breath. Then the voice from the walls said, "Missing." All the figures on the galleries lifted their heads. Thomas heard a gate open behind him. Ada's name was written in the dust at their feet. Under it, Thomas's name appeared letter by letter. The voice spoke again. "Ada Holloway." Ada closed her eyes. Thomas grabbed her hand, but she pulled free. "I answered once," she said. 40 years ago. I was 19. I thought someone needed help." The shadows above began to descend the galleries. "I have been on its list ever since." "Then why did it wait?" "It did not wait," Ada said. It was counting. She thrust the ledger into Thomas's hands and ran toward the administration passage. Ada! She did not turn. The voice filled the hub. Thomas Mercer. The empty cells answered together. Here. Thomas felt the word pulling at him, cold and familiar. He looked down at the ledger. His name was still there. The blank beside it had begun to fill with ink. He remembered the note on the map. Give it the name of the one who began it. He ran to the old records cabinet at the edge of the hub. The drawers were labeled by year. Thomas tore open 1829. Inside was a single transfer slip, cracked at the folds. The name at the top had been smeared by water long ago, but beneath it was a number, 0. Thomas understood then. The prison did not want the first prisoner's name. It wanted a person who had never been counted at all. Someone outside the cells, someone who believed he was free. The voice asked again, Thomas Mercer, are you here? He held the ledger close and walked toward the main gate. Behind him, every shadow was following. Thomas Mercer, are you here? The gate was only 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. At 5 feet, he heard Ada scream from somewhere behind the walls. Thomas nearly turned. Instead, he opened the ledger to the last page, pressed the tip of his brass key into the blank beside his name, and carved one word through the wet ink. Gone. The prison bell rang. The shadows vanished. Every clock began moving at once. 2:18. Thomas pushed through the main gate and fell onto the pavement outside. Dawn was beginning behind the prison walls. The sleet had stopped. Cars moved along Fairmount Avenue as if the night had never happened. He waited for Ada. She never came out. By noon, city officials arrived to secure the building. They found no sign of Ada Holloway in the records office, the hub, or any of the empty cell blocks. They found Thomas's flashlight in the central tower, and on the desk, they found the black night count ledger. The final page carried 2 new entries. Ada Holloway, ear. Thomas Mercer, gone. Thomas left Philadelphia that same week. He never worked in a prison again. For years, he woke at 2:17 every morning to the sound of keys turning in a lock. He told no one about Ada, not until decades later, when Eastern State opened to visitors as a historic site. An old man stood outside the gates on a rainy afternoon and watched tourists enter beneath umbrellas. A guide led a group toward the central hub. Thomas heard the guide say that the old prison had once been built around silence. Then, from deep inside the stone corridors, a voice began to count. 1, 2, 3. Thomas did not move. He waited until the guide was gone. Then he opened the notebook he carried everywhere and looked at the page he had never shown anyone. At the bottom, written in handwriting that was not his, was a question. Thomas Mercer, are you here? Below it, a second line had appeared. Not yet.